pleased and honored to meet introduce my Foreign Policy Research Institute colleague, Dr. Vanessa Neumann, who will be talking about her new book. I'll describe that in a couple of minutes. Just came out, right? Today? Is it today?
Yeah, today. This
Well,
is the first talk. You're the first. Yeah, you're my guinea pig.
Yeah, perfect
Thank
timing,
you.
okay.
I'm a little nervous,
But Vanessa focuses on political risk in the Americas, a consultant, does a number of different things. She does so much I can't really cover it all, but she does a lot of consulting in political, economic, counterterrorism across the Americas. She's the founder and owner of Asymmetrica, an anti-illicit trade and government affairs consultancy that is part of the research network for the UN Security Council's Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate. She is a native of Venezuela, knows a little bit about Venezuela. As a matter of fact, the plan here, if she can find the time, she is a very busy woman, to have her teach a couple of courses here at IWP on Latin America. That's my plan. But, you know, as I say. She has her Ph.D. from Columbia University in theories of justice. She is, as I say, a consultant in a number of areas, and one of the things she does is she's a reviewer for the U.S. Army's teaching text for counterinsurgency in Colombia. Colombia as opposed to Colombia. And as I say, she is the author of Blood Profits, How American Consumers Unwittingly Fund Terrorists, which came out today, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Neumann.
I hope it's not too presumptuous. I just wanted, because you are my first talk, I just wanted to bring my little laptop here just in case. I was on the Acela down, and like typical, oh my God, I have to make changes to my presentation. So I have a little cheat sheet here. I hope not to look at it too much. The idea of the presentation is it's supposed to be sort of somewhat personal, partly because the book is quite personal. So it's personal and professional. It's sort of a professional autobiography that covers what I do, how I started doing it, in 2009 and up until sort of, I guess, early 2017. So I was originally asked to speak about the Americas, so I said, well, actually, let's do it about the book and the Americas. The book covers various areas, but let's just center on what is normally my wheelhouse, which is Latin America. So, as you mentioned, I'm from Venezuela originally. This is a photograph of a protest that was earlier this year in Washington Square Park in New York. The people who organized the protest are friends of mine, and they were lying down to show the protesters that were being killed by the security forces this summer. They were protesting because they were denied what is supposed to be a constitutionally assured referendum, and they were protesting for their democratic rights. So Venezuela is in free fall, and the book is bracketed with how illicit trade funds bad guys, all sorts of different bad guys, all over the place. But I started really, as I say in the opening chapter of the book, out of love and anger, right? So love of two countries, both the United States and Venezuela, which when I was a child were very friendly, and we were allied, so much so, you know, we were always close to the American ambassador, and go celebrate 4th of July at the American embassy, and all of these other things. And then all of a sudden there was a sea change, partly because of corruption and inequality, but what has happened, what has been the solution, has been far, far worse. So the book was originally titled Grievance to Greed. We decided Blood Profits would sell more copies. You know, violence and money, who doesn't respond to that? But the concept of grievance to greed, which is still what underpins the book, is that I started with this rather academic premise that terrorist groups were increasingly behaving like transnational organized crime groups. So they start with this story of why they're angry, what their grievance is, what they want to redress, how they want to flip the government, etc. And then they get, in order to fund their operations, they get into more and more into transnational organized crime. This was a controversial assertion a few years ago because the thinking was terrorist groups, they're just, a terrorist attack is cheap. It's like, 10 grand, you can, or hey, rent a car. You can have a decent terrorist attack. And you don't want to keep the infrastructure of being caught, that you have sort of a larger infrastructure for organized crime. And then the idea is that organized crime groups, they want to do business, they want to stay in business, they don't want to deal with all of that nonsense of terrorists, because that rains down a whole other level of counter-terrorism intelligence operations, which is no joke. So the idea is that actually, and I lay out very clearly in the book why this is really no longer the case, why they are increasingly colluding, and then I show it in action, how I traveled around the world, around certain parts of the world, not the entire world, and saw how, in tracing whether it was the traffic in narcotics or pharmaceuticals or cigarettes and other things like that we quickly came up with, oh my God, holy cow, this is, there's ISIS, there's Al-Shabaab, there's Hezbollah, all benefiting. And we would see how what started with sometimes just overproduction of a consumer good was using an organized crime group to smuggle it across the border, and then everybody would take a cut of money, and we would see that people even that were enemies on different sides of a war zone were all profiting along the way. So that was the idea of grievance to greed. The other idea of grievance to greed originally was that, and this is also reverberates in the book, is that people will then support a charismatic leader, whether it's a Hassan Nasrallah or an Hugo Chavez, or because they're angry about something. And I'm not saying that they're wrong to be angry about it. For instance, in pre-Chavez Venezuela, because I want to stick to what I actually lived through in 3D color, is there was inequality and there was corruption and there was political marginalization. So they throw their hat into the ring, behind this charismatic leader who says, I will be your liberator, I am your defender. And what they are actually doing is manipulating your emotions in order to get themselves into power, and then basically take over, in the case of Venezuela, all the means of production, so that we ended up with this situation today. So what had happened, for instance, let me give you the case studies now. So what has happened in Venezuela, for instance, a lot of the people who are now sanctioned was Tarek El-Aissami, who's my nickname for him is Hezzy Boy, Hezzy Boy. He sort of grew up in a border region, and you see this in other parts of the world, in a border region where he was descended from Syrian family, and they still have very strong Syrian family networks today into Syria, okay? Cousins, and that extend even into the Assad family. And a lot of the drug trafficking that they're doing is with benefits both Hezbollah and the Mexican cartels. However, he grew up, and a lot of the people in his group grew up in the border region between Venezuela and Colombia, where you have a lot of people who have dual citizenship and consider trafficking across the border almost their right. And it became sort of this very toxic brew, and when they have the alliances with this Marxist group, this Marxist ideology, the FARC and the ELN, and they want to overthrow the government based in Colombia, mixed with this insurgent ideology and trafficking through money. Of course, what has happened since then is that, the irony is the people in Chavis's ilk were actually originally were like special forces, really, whose job was to hold back the Cubans. And Venezuela had its own Bay of Pigs incident. So now, when they seize power, they do quite the opposite. They brought all of that drug trafficking, all of that ideology, and all of those ties right in through the presidential palace. And one of the things, there's me crying at the protest, one of the things that the country is in free fall, and lots of other people were crying too, is that one of the things that's stunning is, and the nexus with corruption, is that none of this could happen if you didn't have corrupt leaders at the very top to enable it. I sat for 4 years on the task force on countering illicit trade of the OECD, and my last year on it, they had this integrity week, and they said, "Oh, Dr. Neumann, what is the link between corruption and illicit trade?" I said, "Simple. We've never had a case of illicit trade ever that didn't involve corruption. Not one." And whether it was, Somalia, Iraq, Bulgaria, Venezuela, Colombia, Guatemala, Panama, all of these places are covered in the book. And one of the things that's very interesting to me is that one of the problems with illicit trade and corruption, and what makes the system start to collapse at the end of it, is the asymmetry. I have a thing about asymmetry, given the name of my company, right? There's the asymmetry between those who benefit and those who pay the cost. So once the system becomes very institutionalized, that you have this, everybody's, well, it's just give me a little payoff here and a little payoff there, and everybody takes, nobody, when you're engaged in corruption, it doesn't hurt anybody, really. That's the idea. Who's gonna know? It's just a little bit. There's billions of dollars. It's not. The problem is, it benefits a very small group, and the people who pay the cost is basically everyone. But by the time they feel the pain of the cost, the 30 million people of the country, they've got no food supply, the roads are falling apart, they've got no healthcare system, they can't pay, in the case of Venezuela, Russia and China, because all the money has disappeared. And then those are the people who bear the cost, while an elite sort of benefited. So that's one of the things we see over and over again. So what happened is I got involved in this because I was angry, as I say in the book. I was angry about what I saw happening to the country of my birth, and how it suddenly became an enemy of my other country, which is the United States. And I wanted to understand that dynamic. So I started doing some research for a think tank called the IISS, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, which is stronger in England than it is here. And I think I kind of blagged my way, as the Brits would say, into it, and said, "Oh yeah, sure, I know all about that," and started doing research on Colombian security. Stood up at some Council of the Americas presentation and said to some government minister who was trying to sell me a bill of goods I wasn't about to buy, and I said, "I'm sorry, sir, I respectfully disagree," etc., etc. That got me interviewed by the media about why, and the connections with Venezuela, and that got me invited by the government of Uribe twice. One, to see the changes in security in Colombia, and the second time to actually see what they call their DDR program, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, which at that time was what they're trying to do with the FARC, and at the time it was just the paramilitaries, right, under the Justice and Peace Law, the Justicia y Paz. So, Justicia y Paz was originally, the original form, without getting too technical, of DDR is something called reinsertion, which is like, throw down your weapons, go home. Reintegration is a little bit meatier, more expensive, you do all this psychosocial stuff. But I got to really spend time in the field and see the effects of what had happened, right? And what was the different levels of complicity of how this country basically remained at civil war, had the longest running conflict in the hemisphere, I think one of the longest, possibly the longest running conflict in the world, I believe, if not the second, and how it was basically funded by drugs. And drug trafficking done by a liberation group, right, the FARC, who has this Marxist ideology that wanted land reform. So how did it all come together? And the way it came together was, nobody's hands were clean, right? So they had, when I interviewed, you would interview these villagers, and the villagers had suffered everything. I mean, they suffered the invasion by the FARC, killed a few of their relatives. Then would come the paramilitaries, who were these right-wing private armies that had been set up by landed gentry to fight them, and they came through town, killed a few people. The paramilitary way of taking control of a village was very simple. They'd grab the village elder, like, Mac, come here, stick him in the middle of this square, and start the chainsaw. And start from the ankles up, so you'd start screaming. And that was pretty much the end of that. The village pretty much fell into line. You didn't even need to waste ammo on it, just a little bit of electricity and you were done. So it was very extreme. But even when I was there, and this would have been to 2009, 2010, so it's early on in the book, people were still, bizarrely, they were afraid to call them paramilitaries, and sometimes they even referred to them almost affectionately as los muchachos, the boys. The boys maintained order. At least we didn't have, our girls didn't go running around in short skirts, and curfew was imposed, and there were no robberies or rapes. Well, yeah, except for the ones committed by them. And what had happened was, what the government then had to do, of course with US military backing, was to basically reconquer their terrain. The failure of the Colombian government at the time had been that they only had representation in about a third of the country. So these areas just established their own sort of form of Wild West governance, and that's how. And so they had to unravel all that. By the time the government tries to step back in and reconquer, then they had to basically bribe the villagers to take them back in. But one of the things that was interesting about learning about what the FARC's role in narcotics trafficking and the business as it went along was, of course, I don't know how much you know about Colombia. There you go. About the inner dynamics of Colombia, which is a whole, that's a whole other seminar, basically. That the FARC is, although the world's biggest supplier of cocaine, it's not a cartel in the way we think of, say, the Mexican cartels, because they're not really in there, or have not traditionally been in the retail point. But what a lot of the dynamics that you see between the FARC and the Mexican cartels, or their dealings with the Venezuelan military, who are now the main transshipment point for drugs around the world, is that they made their money because they control the coca field, and they charge a tax of 10% per the kilogram price of coca base. You make coca base by mashing up the leaves and mixing it with kerosene, what we call cocinas in the jungle, and it's sort of a green pasty stuff. A lot of the competition that you see is that they try to get into midstream control of the supply chain, and always, and this sounds like a strange thing to discuss, but so much of my work is about analyzing the supply chain, where the money is, who are the players, and how do they compete and interact, is with the BACRIM, with the bandas criminales, who are the DDR sort of paramilitaries. So they're constantly trying to get it across the border, because if instead of handing it over to the transnational criminal organization, if they themselves can get it across the border to Ecuador or Venezuela or Panama and drop it off there, they triple their profits. So when you look at where they're moving and who they're competing with, it's all about the money. However, what's interesting is that narcotics today is still about only 25 to 50% of their income. So when President Uribe went to the UN and said, and that's me with it, I'm smiling because they kept me safe. He was like, why are you smiling at the soldiers? I'm like, because my life depended upon them. I'm a civilian, and yeah, I was grateful. So that's us in Bogota, and those are, well, that's Bogota. We had been in the jungle for about 10 days prior to when that photo was taken, and I was especially grateful then. But yeah, they're the counter-terrorist special forces. And they, but one of the things that we see a lot is that, when Uribe said, there's a chapter in my book called The Little Fun, which talks about the utter devastation of 2 generations of people. You know, I would see the children whose legs had been blown off by landmines. There'd be a cocktail hour after this talk, don't worry. Yeah, I'm like the cheery one everybody avoids. Anyway, who had stepped on landmines that had been placed by the FARC to protect the coca fields. And they, you know, Uribe then stood up and said, you know, you guys snorting cocaine in New York City are the ones who have kept my country at war. Well, possibly, but they're also into so many other things, including kidnapping, a war tax. I've spoken with a lot of FARC guys, which is very interesting when you fill out your government forms. They're like, do you know any members of foreign terrorist groups? I'm like, yep. Do you correspond with them? Yes, regularly, actually. Always makes for a bit of fun. A little explaining to do. But they talk about that. So one of the things that those terrorist groups, or the Chavistas, for instance, you know, benefit from is anger. This is a slum in Medellin, but we have exactly the same slums in Caracas, Venezuela. So it's that inequality and that desperation. And they paint themselves in some sort of Robin Hood way. And these slums of Medellin are the ones that also protected Pablo Escobar. They viewed him as a Robin Hood hero. That was his stronghold, and that's where he set up a zoo, and he paid them all, and they viewed him as a stick it to the government, because the government had sort of stuck it to them, right? And despite the fact that he was an utter thug, responsible for hundreds of deaths, or thousands of deaths, and blown up airliners, these people still supported him, and they also support other groups like the socialists in Venezuela, the Chavistas. So that's the grievance to greed paradigm, is they go to support a guy who they feel is going to stick it to the man, stick it to the system in favor of them, but in reality, they actually don't care any more about them than the government that sort of abandoned them. So one of the things we really need to do if we want to battle illicit trade is to try and end corruption, easy one, and try and end some sort of demagoguery. So insofar as the point of the book is to make two points really to the consumer. One is understand the consequences of what you do, of what you consume, and then also understand, don't be fooled by sort of demagoguery. So that's the Venezuela, Colombia, which is the start. Panama was very interesting. So there's also the section in the book about Lebanon, and I went from Venezuela, Colombia to Lebanon to find out what was their relationship with Hezbollah, and my plan was I'll just go with a notebook, I'll meet some Hezbollah guys and I'll ask them what's going on. You'd be surprised how effective that is, actually, especially as a woman. You know, they kind of don't, I think they don't really think you're either that smart or that effective or whatever. So I got this, so I had done some research in in Lebanon that had gotten me noticed and had sort of put me on the map of speaking at US government and UK government sort of open meetings on counterterrorism and counter-terrorist finance, and got me wargaming and stuff like that. So that was really sort of the turning point of my career that was around 2012. And then after I sort of like been around and given talks in London and New York and Paris and DC about that, I get an email from somebody who says, hey Vanessa, there's this guy who wants to, from a think tank in the Gulf, wants to hire someone to do some research on illicit trade and funding terrorist groups in Panama. And I go, terrorist groups in Panama? What? They said, yeah, they're convinced that they were at this, at that point they didn't call it terrorist groups, they would say Muslim Brotherhood or whatever. They had a particular bee in their bonnet about that. And I thought, sure, how many years of research, what are you going to pay me? And, you know, anyway, so, and I was fascinated by it because, of course, it's on the border with, with Colombia. And at one time, Venezuela, Colombia, and Panama had all been one country, as well as part of Ecuador. And it's a well-known tax haven and therefore a money laundering center enabled by their banking privacy and secrecy. And I get there, and once again, I said, well, I'll arrive and I have an abaya and I'll just find out some research, find out where to talk to. And the minute I arrive, I talk to, how do I put it, a couple of people who really knew their way around counterterrorism and had been there for a while. And both locals and not locals. And they said, well, actually, we've had a really big problem here because of the illicit, a lot of stuff coming in from the tri-border area of Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina. Comes from there, hits what we call the ABCs, the Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao. Hits also a free trade zone in Colombia and pings through the Panama Canal. And we're convinced that there's some bad guys going on. So the interesting thing about this was, so I said, oh, okay, that's very interesting. Where do you think I should go to find the bad guys? They're like, well, there's a Colon free trade zone and a couple of things. So I get there, and I said, oh, hey, this is all in the book. I'm Venezolana, not American at all. And by the way, I want to see what's going on. Well, I get there, and I get sent to a religious leader who wants to talk to me about converting. And I said, no, I really want to understand your relationship with locals. He says, no, I just do religious conversion. And we get there, and it's all counterfeit sporting goods. That's all they were doing. And that was just, and counterfeit electronics. And that's all, floor to ceiling. And he said, and that's the title of the chapter, he says, you're not who you say you are. Why would they send someone? We don't speak Spanish here, we only speak Arabic. How's your Arabic? I said, very good, actually. So, anyways, he said, well, I'm going to go down the street over there, and I'm going to stand outside. The weather's so beautiful, and I miss my native Venezuela, which has beautiful weather like this, and I'm not going to stay indoors at all, anywhere near you, actually. And I skedaddled out of there and got on the next flight out. I phoned some people, and they said, look, these are bad dudes. This is probably not Muslim Brotherhood. This is probably Hezbollah links. Come home. So the interesting is about that particular chapter is I get an email today from our colleague at FPRI who says that late at night, last night, I don't know how late it could have been because the book was just released today, a lawyer for a guy I referred to in my book, which is Nida Al-Waked, called to complain that he's in my book. And she's a lawyer for a money launderer for, various drug cartels, and the money launderer is based in Panama. So I was a little sick to my stomach before I gave this talk. And so I quickly said, well, the manuscript has been vetted by lawyers, and they said, well, they wanted to know how to reach you. And I'm like, no. No, info@asymmetrica.net. That's how they can reach me or someone who works for me or whatever. And that was that. But the interesting is, so in that particular case, the Nida Al-Waked, who's referred to in the book and whose lawyer emailed this morning or last night, there's not much they can do because he's sanctioned. It was reported by the BBC. I'm not saying anything that's not already in the public forum, but obviously they're afraid that a book will make it more in the public forum, right, than just the BBC news story. So that would be the concern. Was just typical, and it was our almost paradigmatic case for my book, Lebanese, Colombian. There are so many Lebanese Colombians in my book. You have Ayman Juma. There's a whole bunch of them. You could almost categorize them. I should have had an infographic. I had two newspapers, a business in the Colon Free Trade Zone where I sort of had to skedaddle out of the, I think I'm in trouble, and a couple of banks. And as far as I know, I don't put this in the book, but it is whispered loudly that the link is with groups like Hezbollah and other groups like the FARC and also even the Venezuelan regime. In Caracas, people have mentioned this guy's name as being one of their key guys in Panama. That's not in the book, but because I can't put that which is whispered elsewhere. So, to wrap up, because I'd really like to just open it up to questions and see what you want to say, because I could take this in a number of directions and go on and on. There's one of the things that and we can talk about, in Central America, it's been a lot about sort of narcotics and money laundering. What I've worked in Africa and Eastern Europe is a lot of either pharma or cigarettes as well, tobacco smuggling, because it is as profitable. A truck is as profitable as it's as profitable as cocaine, and with much lower penalties. So we're seeing a growing amount of that, especially when you have higher taxes in one region. Because if you're a criminal, you don't pay the taxes, so that's just pure profit margin. So if you undersell the price by a little bit, that's margin for you. So we can discuss that if you want. It's always contentious. People are like, sounds like you're defending smoking. I'm like, no, I'm not defending smoking. I'm not even defending tobacco companies. I'm just saying that there's a lot of organized crime and a lot of bad guys. This is a Botero sculpture. My family actually knew Botero personally. He was a big, you're familiar with his work. He's a Colombian artist and sculptor who does the big round figures. They're all sort of fat. And he's from Medellin, so I always joke, those are the two really people who are really famous on the international scene from Medellin, Pablo Escobar and Fernando Botero. So in the heart of Medellin, there's a bunch of Botero sculptures, and one of them stands there, and that was exploded by a bomb. I can't actually remember whether it was a drug cartel bomb or a FARC bomb, but at that point in Colombia, like so many people were setting off bombs, it's almost got hard to tell, but they've left it there as in what is now a rather beautiful park in the rejuvenated city to remind themselves of times gone by and what they don't want to go back to. So one of the things that so I guess the reason why I put that photograph is because, like my book, the reason why I chose to write a book about sort of seeing it in action and to a wide audience is so that we can understand how the impact of the choices we make are inscribed on the bodies of millions of people, all around the world. If it weren't for our being led by demagogues or our willingness to consume illicit goods, I wouldn't see the children in the jungles of Colombia with their missing legs, or have a bomb go off in Mogadishu just down the street from my, partner at the time. All of this where we could see in that case in Somalia, we had the sort of boxes of cigarettes next to the AK-47s, and you could swap them out, how many cigarettes for how many AKs. Or RPGs in an open marketplace as if you were buying fruit. So, and that came out of Dubai. Those particular shipments came through Dubai and into northern Somalia, and Port of Berbera and Puntland, and then down into Mob. So that's it really. That was, I hope you enjoy the book. I know, after all that, it is, it should bring awareness of how interconnected we are. And that goes back to, I guess, my training as a philosopher. You meant, Mac talked about my doctorate in theories of justice. And theories of justice is basically about what is the government that we want? What is our relationship to our government? How do we want, and all of that comes back to how do we want to live our lives? And what do we expect out of the people who govern us? And what is our relationship of our sense of our responsibilities and our duties to achieve that? And part of that is understanding the causality of our choices on community around us. You know, how much of what we do here in America impacts or causes violence or funds violence overseas or even in our own cities. So that was the point of the book, and I try and make it a little bit juicy, as sort of, you know, woman entrepreneurs travels around dicey places, gets into near scrapes, and writes a book about it. So I hope you enjoy it, and I welcome your questions. Please ask away. Thank you.